Okay, good morning. It's official. We're ready to start. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Renee Vaugeois, for those of you that don't know me. I work with the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, and I'm excited to have the time to talk to you today about human rights and about kind of the architecture of human rights. This is the first in what will be a series of sessions around not only like the theory and principles and practice of human rights, but also kind of digging into future ones. We'll look at complaint mechanisms and different ways that we can use human rights to advocate and to advance efforts. So you'll notice that we've got closed captioning going on here. And I think the manner of the presentation today will be, there's a lot of content. I'll warn you about that. I know some of you have been part of these sessions in person before. So I hope I'm not I hope I'm adding to your arsenal and things are well. So, okay, we're going to get started here. And what I was going to say is feel free to pop things in the chat. I'm going to keep it live and open and watch it as I go. And feel free to pop things in there and I'll try and kind of address things as we go. And like I said, there's a lot of content, so hopefully I can be amusing enough for you so that this presentation goes well. All right. So firstly, I firstly just want to acknowledge we're coming from you here in Amiskwichi-Waskahegan, which is up in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. And just want to really recognize, where we're coming from, all of us in our journeys and our ancestors along the way. But I think, prior to this session today, of course, a lot of us have in our mind what's happening down in the United States. And I think a lot of people think up here in Canada, in the northern part of Turtle Island, that maybe it's not quite as bad. Well, I tend to question that in the sense that I think in Canada, it's just different and things are more covert, I would like to say. So prior to this session, and it was really, I think I'm coming in with a bit of a heavy heart. One of our advocates, our Stride advocates, shared a video that one of her friends caught last year of an Indigenous man dying at the hands of EPS. And so it's, while we know these things are happening in the States, they are happening here. And I think all of us that are on this call today know that human rights are relevant everywhere. And it's about us engaging with them to make them real, but also to hold people to account. And I just want to acknowledge that, it's the first peoples of this land, that there's the genocide that has happened and is ongoing. And continues to happen on a daily basis. We all need to be aware of it. And I want to acknowledge that because that, it's important that we're talking about that. And then in the context of what's happening in the States, but also more broadly. So we're here and we're going to talk about today kind of the international architecture of human rights. And as many of you may know already, really the architecture of human rights really started to formulate at the international level in post-World War II, when we, in 1948, had the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights really kind of came out of this idea that people didn't want to see things repeated after World War II, the devastation that happened, the amount of refugees that were around the world. But when we look at the real stats, even today, things are just as bad as they were then in terms of the numbers of refugees, the numbers of migrants, the human rights violations that are happening around the world. So while we have these documents that have been built, they're not reality yet. And the trick is, and we'll talk a little bit more about today, is for human rights to be real and to move beyond that paper, it really requires us as the everyday folk to push and to know about these rights and use them because they are tools. And we'll talk more about that today. So I just want to contextualize in terms of starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when we talk about human rights, it's really, really critical to think about human rights as this idea that they're holistic and universal and interdependent. And what I mean by that is, if we don't have, say, food in our bellies, it's hard for us to be able to have the right to education. All of them are fundamentally interconnected. And so it's hard to have like a hierarchy of rights, but understanding that we need a number of things to be whole, healthy human beings. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the overarching framework to start this conversation, where was this idea of the Universal Declaration is like 30 articles around all those things that we need to live a life of well-being, but also to achieve our full potential. So it's this idea of like those basic things that we need to survive, but what are also those things that we need to be flourishing and to live with dignity. So that's kind of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And, you know, I think it's a very important document in the sense that a lot of criticism around human rights is based on the idea that it's a Western concept or it's a Western construct. And I like to challenge that a little bit, because when we look back to the history of the Declaration of Human Rights, it was actually countries like Chile, Uruguay, China, Lebanon, United States, and other countries that came together to really put this Universal Declaration into practice and into writing. And we are called the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights because it was John Humphrey, who was a Canadian lawyer and a person living with disability, who was the one that sat and facilitated that space for all those folks and helped to write. He wrote that draft of the Universal Declaration and really was a pivotal person behind it. And he came back to Canada in 1966 and started the Canadian Human Rights Education Foundation, of which the John Humphrey Center comes from. We are a legacy of that. And so when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when we talk about human rights, there's two important terms to understand. And one is being this idea of a declaration, and one is this idea of a convention or a treaty. So when we talk about a declaration at the international level, what that means is a declaration is considered a principal document. It's not legally binding. It's kind of this thing that we aspire to. These are these things that we agree that we need and that we want to be law. However, it's more of a principal document. It's like the starting point. So for example, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People at this point is a principal document. It's not legally binding law at this point. However, when something becomes a treaty or a convention, so for example, the Convention on the Rights of Children or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, that is when it becomes law, international law. So that's important to understand, because we can use these conventions and treaties as tools to demand human rights, whereas the declarations are more principal documents. So the Universal Declaration was the first kind of principal document at the international level around human rights, which laid out kind of these pieces that we needed to live a life of well-being and to achieve our full potential. And the goal coming from that declaration was to translate that right away into a convention, an international convention, which would become international law. It wasn't until 1966, however, that, so it took 18 years at the international level to get to the point where we had an International Bill of Rights. And that International Bill of Rights includes the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also then the International Convention on Civil Political Rights. And what's interesting about that is that ideally, after the Universal Declaration was passed in 1948, the idea was to have one convention which would be overarching for all rights. However, what happened was politics always gets involved at the United Nations, and during that time was when you did see a real split in the world between the Eastern maybe ideologies and thoughts or worldviews, and those of the Western ideologies, thoughts, and worldviews, where in the West, it was very much this idea like civil and political rights were key and critical. And what's interesting about civil and political rights is that they're often the things that can be enshrined into legislation or into law quite easily, like the right to vote or the right to a lawyer, those kind of things. However, when we talk about economic and social and cultural rights, these are more longer term rights. These are rights like the right to housing, the right to identity, consciousness, all these pieces. And those rights aren't so easily just instilled into legislation. They're bigger, they're not bigger picture than civil political rights, but they're more progressive in terms of long term. And so the United Nations talks about this idea of what they call progressive realization. And what that means is that every country should strive to progressively realize the rights within conventions and treaties, meaning they should improve all the time, every year. And so this is a bit of a construct that we'll talk a little bit more about today, and continue to go through. So I'm going to take us to the next slide. I feel like I'm forgetting to tell you something here, but things always come along the way. All right, so when we talk about, and now I know what I was going to say because it comes right to this next slide. When we talk about these international documents and these treaties, when a country like Canada signs on to a convention, so for example, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Canada then makes a commitment to strive to protect human rights in the sense that they must strive to kind of integrate into their national laws and legislation, and shift their laws and legislation to ensure they align with and abide by these conventions. But the other piece is that these conventions should also guide and drive kind of national programming around certain issues. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but the key thing in Canada that we can come across to is the issues of jurisdiction. And this is a big thing for Canada that we have to negotiate, which we'll talk more about in a second. But when we talk about human rights, I think the most important thing I want to get across with this slide is that we need to look at human rights as this constant feedback loop, this constant feedback process. So while the international level sets these standards by which countries will then sign on to and agree to, the country is then supposed to put these into their international laws, into programs, strive to realize these rights. But unless there is folks and citizens really holding their government to account, really questioning where are we on these conventions, where are we on these protocols, governments can really, not have a lot of pressure to put these international documents into play. So the power of civil society in human rights is so critical, and human rights are only as strong as civil society's engagement with them. So when we talk about these human rights, they come down to us and they set standards, but we also have to provide feedback loops up to both the government and to the United Nations to really create this feedback loop so that human rights are evolving and they're not static and stuck on pages of paper. So at every level of state, there will be a responsibility to human rights. I'll come back to that in a sec. So when we talk about human rights, I always like to think about human rights really within kind of four arching pillars. I'm just I have my chat and my participant list hanging right over by my slides, so I'm just sorry, just move them over. So there's kind of these four overarching pillars of human rights. When the United Nations talks about, particularly when they talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they always talk about the 3 Ps, they call them. Provision, protection, and participation. However, we really feel, and I really feel, and I know a number of colleagues I work with feel that there's a missing pillar in that, and that is the idea of remedy and a justice. So I'm just going to walk through these with you for a second and connect them. So the provision element of human rights is really this idea that right to the security of the person, these pieces around government or the state has responsibilities for ensuring that there's housing, that people are housed, that there's food, those things that we need to just be secure in who we are and live a life of security. So provision is that the kind of these social rights in some ways that we have. When we talk about protection rights, what that means is it's really this idea that when we implement human rights, there is a need to have laws or policies and practices in place that protect you from the violation rights of others. Okay. Yeah, we'll get there, Chris. That'll be the hopes by the end of this presentation. So protection kind of are those things to make sure that we are protected from the violation of rights from others, whether it's the state or whether it's by a business or those kind of things. And that is the idea that we should be able to live in freedom and not be imposed on by others. The third P is about this idea of participation. A lot of times we could consider these kind of those political rights. And participation is this idea to live in dignity. We really need to be able to participate in the decisions that affect us, whether it's a child in a school or whether it's, you know, an employee in the workplace. We have stronger spaces and people when people are able to participate in those decisions that affect us. And that includes, you know, all the way up to the national level, being able to provide input. It's not just about the right to vote. It's much more than that. And you know, if we think about building sustainable and appropriate solutions to problems, it requires the participation of people to be relevant. So those three P's are kind of the critical pillars around human rights. But the fourth pillar, which, you know, we as advocates are keen about, is this idea of justice. How do we seek justice? But how do we have remedy when our rights are violated? For if we do not have a space to remedy our rights when they've been violated, then really rights do not exist. And so this piece about remedy is really, really critical. And when a state is looking at human rights, and when any sort of government is looking at how you implement and apply human rights, it's really critical for them to find balance between these four pillars. A lot of times you'll maybe see a state will have strong protection things in place for rights, but maybe they're totally missing the pieces around provision and participation or remedy. Canada has often been, in some of the processes, which I'll talk about in a little bit, criticized for our lack of ability to engage people in participating in these decisions. So when we're talking about rights, whether it's an organization, a city, whatever, they need to be looking at these four pillars of human rights and really ensuring that all of them are addressed to ensure that we have a rights-based approach. So there should always be remedy spaces, whether it's in a school or wherever, to allow people to address when their rights are being violated, but also to create a space where there's independence in that discussion. So these four principles are really kind of critical, and again, I just want to really reaffirm, it's this idea that we need all of four of them in order to be able to achieve that life of well-being and to achieve our full potential. All right. So the other important piece about human rights law, and we'll get more about this in a piece, like when we get human rights into national laws, but even because it is international law, it is considered primacy law. And so just what I mean about that, so say for example in Alberta, we have different acts, for example, whether it's the Policing Act or whatever. If there is a violation of rights within these acts, the Human Rights Act always trumps it. So we always have to look at legislation through a lens of flexibility, adaptability, and evolution, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is a lot of the laws in Canada have been built prior to the human rights, for example, and they have been built on our history of colonization and of genocide. So they're not necessarily fully in line with human rights. So human rights really provides us this tool to make sure that we can adjust and evolve our laws so that they are relevant and appropriate. So when there is a challenge within a specific act, the Human Rights Act will always be paramount over another one. So it's just important to know, and it's important to know to also think about human rights, particularly from the international level, these conventions and that, is that they actually set precedent over the state. And so they are these guiding tools that we can use. So and this is kind of something I was talking a little bit about already, and you can combine, if we think about human rights and say we think about a child, and we then start to think about like all of the levels of responsibility around that child. You know, we have a family around the child, we'll have community, we'll have the school, we start to have the municipal level government, provincial government, federal government, perhaps maybe, you know, our First Nations government up at that federal level. There's all these levels along the way that have certain responsibilities to that child. So every level of government is obligated under these international laws to meet our, like, to strive for these rights that we're going to talk more about today. But so, and then the child or the individual also should have the capacity to claim their rights at every level along the way and have spaces for remedy along the way. And so that feedback piece, Chris, that we'll talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more about, is where along the way can we provide input? Where along the way can we contribute to or make claims to those rights? So Jess, you say, I'm not quite clear on which laws trump the Canadian laws that violate rights and what the difference is. Okay, we'll get more on that as we go along. You know, it's kind of, hopefully by the end, we're clear on that, Jess. Okay, awesome. Okay, so these two slides are just gonna be really quick. I just wanna quickly talk about, you know, us as advocates, you know, and us as people. How do we engage? How do we engage in human rights? And a lot of times I'm always thinking about these kind of quadrants and how we're engaged. And when I think about how we engage and defend our rights, I think there are a number of different ways. And I also think it's really important for us as advocates to recognize and value other ways of advancing human rights that are not like our own. So for example, we will have people, for example, under the education, who really are the people who are ready to put themselves on the line and to speak the truth. We see that with the rallies right now with George Floyd and everything that's happening. There are those that will stand up and be vocal, but there are some that are not. There are maybe those ones that are, I like to see myself as this way, maybe facilitators. When I see a complex issue, I want to try and identify people I can bring together so we can strategize and build solutions together. Or perhaps I'm going to organize people to come together so that we can start to build a longer term strategy, but also find those points where we can poke along the way and start to evolve things. Thinking about human rights as a longer term project. And yes, we need immediate changes, but we can do that through more longer term advocacy. Other ways that we can engage in human rights are directly supporting people to claim their rights. And we'll talk more about that again today too, but this piece about individual advocacy, a lot of times people will feel like, oh, you know, it's just me, or it's just one person and I'm not going to be able to change anything. But when we use the human rights tools, we then set the precedents that will affect change for others down the road. And so there's advocacy through human rights system, but then there's advocacy through other mechanisms as well, which we'll talk about. And then the other piece, the fourth area of advocacy of human rights defenders, I really believe, is this idea of documenting and witnessing. And what I mean by that is it's kind of, one of the things I know is that a lot of the systems that we have that will monitor perhaps human rights, or they take complaints, they will only get a sliver of what the realities are in relation to human rights. Whereas if we can create civic spaces where we are actually documenting human rights issues, then we can collectively bring those forward to affect greater change and to demand systemic change. Because we know that it's sometimes numbers that will convince people. But there's also this idea of witnessing and being present. And to me, that's a little bit about what documentation is as well. And I'm just going to give you an example of what I mean about the documentation piece. So I'm also part of like a group called the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee. And when I became part of that group, it's a coalition of law enforcement as well as community agencies. And I was absolutely shocked when I started working with this group that hate against the Indigenous community was not even on their radar or in their records, because people from the Indigenous community do not report hate crime. So because they don't report hate crime, those working in those bureaucracies or those spaces don't necessarily have them in their eyesight or consider them a problem because they're not in the stats. However, that's not reality. So those of us on the ground really need to be able to document and translate these issues to policymakers in a way that it's palatable, and it's a hard journey. Yeah, good point, Angela. I'll share some more about that as well, perhaps as we go through this. So those kind of just gives you a different idea. And I think it's just really important to understand that we need all of these folks to be able to make an impact on human rights. And we all can fit in different ways, and not to feel like we're not doing enough when we're not, you know, filling in all those spaces. So I think it's just really important to understand that. And this program that we're doing this session is part of this issue of documentation and advocacy. Is we've been at the John Humphrey Center working with partners to build this program called Stride Advocacy. And really what we're trying to do is build a network of advocates across the province, but also build capacity among all of us to know, how do we effectively poke and navigate these spaces a little bit better? How do we do systemic advocacy work together? Because we need spaces outside of government and that to be able to talk about these issues and move them forward. Yes, and Nadine, that's a huge thing. The normalization of hate and racism is a massive thing. So these Stride advocates, and this would be kind of like the first training in that, is like, our goal is really to document what's happening in our communities, and be a kind of a safety net for community, and really help people walk through. Because as many of you will know, when you're a victim of human rights, whether it's like a hate, whatever, it impacts us in so many different ways, our mental health, our physical health. And sometimes having people in community who just believe us and work with us can make a huge difference. So we are really a bunch of folks, and there's a number of you on here trying to work together to really draw change. And I think what I want to say here too, one last piece, is that this is a provincial network, where there's groups of us working at our community levels around advocacy, which is important. I really think it's really critical that there's a network of us at the provincial level pushing, because you know, we can work at our community level and spin our wheels there, but we need to look outwards, and we also need to engage with the different levels of legislation along the way to make sure we're having an impact. So there's the municipal, there's the provincial, there's the federal, but then there's also the First Nations reserves. There's the First Nations governments, maybe better language. Okay. So I'm not going to leave this slide up for too long, but I just want to paint you a really quick picture of like, so what do we have? What are those spaces that we have for remedy, or to like document and to take these complaints elsewhere? And you'll notice I've kind of got listed here, like at the international level, the national level, provincial level, and then below that, we'll talk about that. But at the international level, and I'm going to go through each of these a little bit more in detail in a second, we have a number of areas where we can provide input about human rights, but also where we can file human rights complaints. So there are complaint mechanisms where you can submit individual complaints at the UN Human Rights Council. There's also an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights where we can submit complaints. The other thing I have listed there is called universal jurisdiction. And this is a bit of an emerging legal area. And what the universal jurisdiction is, for example, say, I'll talk about stuff I know, but there's, for example, I realize I can't really talk about specific cases. I realize this is being recorded too. And normally I'm quite liberal at the lips about stuff, and I'm realizing because it's recorded, I need to be a little bit more sensitive. But say there's a human rights violation that's happening in a country, and it's the perpetrator perhaps goes elsewhere, and lands into Canada, for example. So look at in Rwanda, for example, with the genocide. There was some people that were in Canada following the genocide. And what happened is, through universal jurisdiction, there are some countries in the world that will try cases from other countries under this idea of universal jurisdiction. So for example, there's cases right now happening in Germany and South Africa related to human rights violations that have been happening in Turkey. So it's a really emerging area, and it's an interesting area, but we won't spend a lot of time on it because I'm still learning as well. And then in terms, so that's the complaint mechanisms at that international level. In terms of spaces where we can report and document maybe more systemic stuff, we have a universal periodic review process, which I'll tell you more about in a second, as well as convention committees and special procedures. So I'm going to go in detail about all those pieces so you can see them a little bit better and how we can engage with them. At the national level, as you all know, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the really kind of critical thing about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to understand is that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms really gives us the tool to protect us from state abuse. So at the United Nations level, there is a declaration around violence of states or the abuse of power by the states. The Canadian Charter really gives us that document where if our rights are being violated by the government, we have a tool to fight back. But it's not necessarily to protect me from, say, Nadine. Nadine, I see your name up on screen, so I'm just going to refer to you. It's not those interpersonal things. It's between the community and the state. Whereas when we go to like the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Canadian Human Rights Act then gives us tools whereby we can try to hold account, say, a business or those that violate our rights that are outside of the state, but also including the state as well. So I'll go over those in a little bit more detail. And we have the Canadian Human Rights Commission at the federal level, kind of providing that space for complaint and remedy. I will say at the national level, we are severely lacking in terms of spaces where we can go to take issues forward. The Federal Human Rights Commission is a pretty great agency, and the people in there are very progressive and doing good work. However, commissions are saddled with their own challenges in terms of resources and capacity, but it is a really good space. In terms of reporting mechanisms, though, at the national level, there's not a lot. My thought would be is when we have a convention signed at the international level, in my mind, what would be realistic was that at the national level, we should have a body or some sort of space where, or ombudsperson idea that is really responsible for ensuring that that convention then goes down and becomes real, both across all the provinces as well as at the national level. And sorry, I always kind of get stuck a little bit here because I always feel like there's a huge conversation here in Canada around jurisdiction and where we get stuck. Oh wow, Susanna, that's interesting about Saskatchewan. So where we get stuck a lot of times is that the provincial governments then become responsible for the implementation of human rights primarily, and we'll get into jurisdiction a little bit more in a bit, but provincial government do not have to report to any international mechanisms or any national mechanisms really to say that. So there is a real gap in terms of us being able to hold accountability to these conventions within Canada because of jurisdiction. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit. At the provincial level, we do have the Human Rights Act and the Human Rights Commission, which we can reach into. At the provincial level, the Human Rights Commission is very overwhelmed and under-resourced, and it is very behind. Like, it has a very long wait list in terms of getting processes through, and they're trying to clean that up, and they're trying to streamline those systems. The challenge is, and my numbers could be off a little bit because a bit dated, but I think there's like around 17,000 complaints every year that go into the Alberta Human Rights Commission. So there is a goal to kind of weed ones out. And so, there's, like, for example, I was just working recently on one where the individual did not want to, due to COVID, did not want to do her mediation online and asked for it to be delayed until September, and they just closed the case. So we always have to be, when we're dealing with the commissions, really cautious about how we engage and make sure that we use them effectively. The other thing that we have at the provincial level is we do have some advocates and mechanisms. So for example, we have the Alberta Health Advocate, we have patient relations with Alberta Health Services, we have the Office of the Persons with Disability, Office of the Advocate of Persons with Disabilities. We have a number of these other spaces that are more kind of, you know, subsidiary to the provincial level. They're part of the provincial government, but they provide us other mechanisms where we can document and report. And then when we get to the municipal level or school level, there's not a lot of places for complaints or documentation, which is something that I think a lot of us should be pushing for. I'd like to see every municipality with a remedy space. I think it's critical. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is in relation to the UN treaties. And yes, Joe, I'm recording this, so we'll make sure we can post it up afterwards. And what I've done for some of my screenshots is or for my slides, I've done screenshots of important websites that you can go to access more information. And I think these websites are important. So as you know, Canada has signed on to a number of different conventions at the international level. And this is a listing here of what Canada has signed on to in terms of conventions. So the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel and Inhumane or Degrading Treatment. We've got the Convention on, you know, the Rights of the Child, on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So these are all the conventions that Canada has signed on to and agreed. Now, at the United Nations level, what they have in terms of mechanisms for these conventions is that every time a convention is set up, there's also a committee that's set up. And this committee is responsible for observing and monitoring the human rights progress of each state in relation to that convention. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, has a committee that meets consistently, and they review countries. When they review a country, they'll look at information from civil society, so from different agencies and organizations that are maybe working around human rights. They're going to look at different kind of UN reports that may come in, whether it's through UNICEF or UNIFEM. They'll also look at, the government will also be responsible for submitting their own report to the UN committee. So there's this effort to really kind of make sure that a country is being consistently looked at in relation to these conventions, and have this space where there's this progressive realization of human rights. So this is a really kind of important touch point, but what one of the challenges is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, is what then has happened at the United Nations is we have a very fragmented architecture of human rights where we have, you know, migrant rights, children's rights, women's rights, all in these different spaces, but maybe we're not looking at a country holistically, but they are important spaces. So this is a mechanism. Say you're working on disability rights, for example, and you really feel Canada has a lot of work to do, you can engage by writing shadow reports, or you can engage with those committees to make sure that your perspective is brought forward through reports. Jess says, why do some have a ratification dates but not a signature? Good question. I'm not sure. I can't answer that, Jess, so I can follow up with that one though after. All right, so that's the treaty, the kind of the UN treaties that we've signed on to, and just knowing that each of those treaties has a committee by which we as citizens can submit reports to. And these things are called shadow reports, and I'll talk about them more in a second. And these shadow reports are like, you know, tight 4-page reports, which we go in, which kind of articulates what the realities are for human rights are, but also provide tangible recommendations to our government, which then the UN agency will look through and use those recommendations as ways to ask Canada to affect change. Okay. So remember how I was just talking about, you know, the fracturing of human rights at that international level, and this idea that we have all these different pockets of groups working towards their human rights, but yet we're not really looking at Canada holistically. So what happened in the later 2000s, like 2007, 2009 was the first for Canada, was the United Nations really had a regrowth and a reemergence of energy around human rights in the 1990s. And that was thanks to like Kofi Annan and a number of folks. You know, between 1966 to 1993, there was like a lot of, there was a bit of a, like, it was very static. Human rights weren't really evolving forward in the UN. From 1993 onwards, we saw a revision of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, but we also saw in the 2000s the development of this process called the Universal Periodic Review. So the universe, I'll get to that, Jacqueline, and share some of this stuff in a second that might give you a reason why this is important. Sorry, I'm trying to read. So the Universal Periodic Review process is similarly to the committees, is a process that happens every 4.5 years for every country. So you can kind of see, this is a really great website to go to, uprinfo.org, and it will tell you about every country and where their status at. But what's important for us as citizens to know is that the Universal Periodic Review, you can see the timeline down there. So the first time that Canada had a review was in like 2009, and then again in 2013, and just again in 2018, and our next one is coming up 2023. Yeah, so the piece about these Universal Periodic Review process, as you can see, is that what will happen is there will be a convening around a specific country, and the United Nations then accepts, like, again, these shadow reports and stuff like that that come from civil society agencies and stuff like that. And they will really work to look more holistically at Canada or whatever country it is. In 2009, in our first review, the biggest issues that came up for me in the reporting were issues around violence against women, particularly Indigenous women. There was a lot of concern around Canada's not so great ability to engage in consultation and engaging people in feedback. Just for an example, like with the Universal Periodic Review, Canada's really obligated to engage with civil society in between each of the reviews to make sure that citizens' feedback is engaged. However, Canada doesn't do a great job, and it's been pointed out as well at the UN level, and that's come out through some of the Universal Periodic Review. My experience with the Universal Periodic Review is interesting because in the first run, 2009, I remember it's Canadian Heritage that's kind of responsible for kind of pulling this information together. In the very first one, they came out, and I remember I gave them like 210 names in Alberta to come out and potentially meet with and talk to. And I attended one that happened in Edmonton. And what was interesting is there wasn't a huge group of civil society there, but what happened was because nobody knew what the Universal Periodic Review, the whole afternoon was spent talking about what it was versus talking about the issues. And since that time, I've never seen another invite to participate in this kind of consultation process around the Universal Periodic Review. So there's a huge barrier there in terms of Canada's engagement with us, but there are mechanisms that we can use. And through this Universal Periodic Review, we can submit shadow reports. I did test that out in the second round, and we submitted a report with some agencies in Calgary around poverty and around human rights education. And what was interesting is one of our recommendations was picked up and put towards Canada, which was encouraging for me to see that it was reviewed and actually engaged. So this process is one piece, and another piece of the United Nations that exists for us to engage within. And really, you can see the next UPR is May 2023. There's a lot of opportunity for us to really be able to put some of these really hard systemic issues forward. Because what I find in Canada as well is we don't have a lot of civil society engaging in these processes. So when the federal government puts a report forward to these processes, they don't have a lot of that grassroots input and feedback. into the mechanism, which is really critical to be able to have a wholesome view. So there's a lot of potential for shadow reporting and providing our feedback there. And I just wanted to put up this slide quickly so you can kind of see what the UN says is that, and I'll share this with you because these links will work for you. We can provide, as I said, direct feedback into this process, and the shadow reports get submitted directly to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. And it is quite a simple process, and there's a technical guide for that 4-page shadow report. So I can share this document out to you. All right, so we've talked about the convention committees that exist. We've talked about the Universal Periodic Review that exists. Now I want to talk about one more thing, and these are called special procedures at the United Nations. What are special procedures? Well, special procedures are usually what people refer to them are called special rapporteurs. And I want to step back a sec to the previous slide in terms of talking about the Universal Periodic Review, because Canada has had, so this listing that you see in front of you are special rapporteurs that have come and investigated Canada on our own soil here. So these special rapporteurs, what they are mechanisms at the United Nations, and what they do is they kind of monitor and they look at what is the government, say the government of Canada, saying in relation to the rights around housing, for example. And then what is civil society saying? Are they congruent? Do they kind of align? If they don't, if what the government is saying is absolutely polar opposite to what maybe civil society is saying, these special rapporteurs can ask to come and do an investigation into a country. So they'll come into Canada, say for a couple weeks, and they will do a monitoring visit. They'll meet with agencies, they'll meet with the government, and they'll try and get a better lay of the land by actually having that face-to-face connection. What's interesting about this one is that in before 2013, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, at the time his name was James Anaya, had been trying to come to Canada for a number of years. But the trick was he couldn't enter into Canadian soil until he had an official invite from the government of Canada. He couldn't get that invite until it was like I think it was the day before Canada's presentation and review at the Universal Periodic Review in 2013 that Canada decided to, they decided to officially invite James Anaya into Canada. 2, it was right before the Universal Periodic Review that Canada decided to move ahead with approving the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So while we may think these mechanisms don't matter, that was a success. That was a win, because James Anaya's visit to Canada was really critical, and also Canada signing on to the declaration was really critical. And sometimes that shaming at that international level is enough for us to get the movement forward. So you can see the different ways, the different ones that Canada has been. Some of the more recent ones has been disability, was in April last year. And that one was really interesting because, and I can share that report with you after this, Canada got a failing grade in terms of how well we're doing in the realization of rights for people living with disabilities. So that was very interesting. And I thought it was interesting to see the one on toxic waste coming to Canada. It might be one I want to look at a little bit more. So when these rapporteurs come, they'll write a formal report that's made public, and those reports will also be used in these UN reporting mechanisms and these accountability mechanisms that exist. So those are kind of the 3 kind of reporting spaces that we have to document those more systemic issues at the United Nations and kind of push for things. But there's also a human rights complaint mechanism at the UN, which I'm going to talk about now. So the UN Human Rights Council is very much like our provincial commission or our national commission. This is a space where they can hear individual complaints about human rights. They have a very simple kind of complaint form. And it gets submitted in. I won't go into super detail about processes and stuff like that, but what I will get into, kind of addressing some of the chat that's come up, is like, why does it matter? And the one case I want to kind of pull up with and talk about is in relation to the Indian Act. So as many of you know, the Indian Act is, a discriminatory document in and of itself, and there are a lot of barriers and challenges to that. And it was 1977 that Sandra Lovelace, who is now a Canadian senator, decided to take a complaint up to the United Nations Human Rights Council. She had tried taking her complaint up to the Northwest Territories Commission. She had tried at the Supreme Court level. And essentially she, was challenging the fact, and you can see there, she was challenging the law that stripped Indigenous women of their status after marriage to a non-Indigenous man. She lost rights to property and all these things. So she took that all the way up to the UN level in 1977. And then in 1981, some decisions were made at the UN in relation to this case, which forced Canada to start looking at the discrimination within the Indian Act. In 1985, we started to see then changes starting to be made to the Indian Act, particularly around gender discrimination. While it's not all perfect, these things start to create the movement we need to start to open these things up and shift them. Right now at the United Nations, we also now have Sharon McIver, who's from BC, who's another woman, Indigenous woman, who's really pushing a little bit harder on the gender discrimination around the Indian Act. So what's interesting about, I think, the UN Human Rights Council level is it allows us a space outside of our state to have our complaints heard. And if they're strong, I think have a lot of potential to impact. And, when a judgment is made at the United Nations level that a country has to really look at a specific law or practice, there's the pressure there to do it. While we don't have international courts and these enforcement mechanisms, this soft power of pressure on states does work. And while we may complain that they don't work, they're useless, whatever it is that you may feel, my argument to that is that they are all we have. Without these spaces, we have nothing else to take our human rights complaints forward or move them forward. Aside from filling the streets, which we know I'll speak here in Edmonton, it's not that easy to get people out. I'm always amazed at how many people come out in Montreal, for example. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of like the UN level. And what do we have at the UN level? We have this council, and we also have these reporting mechanisms, which I feel the further I get in my life, I feel they're really critical. And I feel some of the cases that we have, we need to take up to this level. As we're talking about George Floyd, I can't help but think about all the cases that exist around unsolved murders, missing and murdered Indigenous women report that came out, a year ago yesterday. All of this stuff around the impunity of violence by police is a huge issue, which I do not think we can gain traction within our national laws and within our national systems. And perhaps it is at the UN level that we can affect some change there. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the kind of national. Let's get to the national. So as I was mentioning before, we have, of course, we have these two levels, the federal versus the provincial jurisdictions. And I just kind of really want to quickly review that. And there's the, there's the Canadian Human Rights Act, and there's the Provincial Human Rights Act. And as you know, each level of government has responsibility for different areas under their jurisdiction. So under the Federal Human Rights Act, any discrimination, and this is the important piece too, is that the way that the acts are built is that a human rights violation is really based on this idea of discrimination. So I've been discriminated against in accessing a service, or I've been discriminated against in my workplace, which is great. However, it is also quite limiting, I believe, in my mind, in the sense that it doesn't give us a space to try to claim our rights when maybe it's not, for example, with housing or with, the right to education, quality education, the right to quality housing. those kind of things are not necessarily things that we can claim under the commissions or the acts. What we can only claim is if we can prove discrimination based on a certain ground, whether it's my race, my gender, my gender identity. So understanding that the legislation we have around the acts is really built around this idea of being discriminated against, being treated differently than another group of people. So under the federal, those that are kind of where we can file federally is in relation to those things that are under federal jurisdiction. So crown corporations, post offices, banks. Some of you might remember that case in Vancouver a couple months ago where it was a grandfather who took his daughter into Bank of Montreal. And they were discriminated against, and not only by the bank, but I also believe by the law enforcement. That would have been a really great example of a case that could go to the Federal Human Rights Commission. It's based on banks, but it's also really based on a refusal of service based on somebody's ancestry or race. So you can kind of see under there the provincial, there's the transportation piece. There's the pieces around any, the RCMP, that's a big one under this one. And one of the things I just want to point out, there's often when we have an issue with an RCMP or a law enforcement officer or say a doctor, we'll often go to say, with a doctor, we'll go to the medical association, or with the police, we'll go to the police commission. Some of the challenges with that is that they are fundamentally interconnected and intertwined with the agencies that they're supposed to be investigating. So the value of these commissions is it gives you a bit more of a separate space to file complaints. And I believe people should file there before they file at some of these professional associations. No, Jess, it's both levels, the discrimination. Yeah, it's all built around that. And that's a bit of a challenge of our laws nationally, is that it is built around discrimination rather than rights. So that's the federal. Now, this picture I have on the other side is kind of from the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and it kind of articulates what the provincial legislation is around the human rights commissions. And so the discrimination around human rights at the provincial level is in relation to employment, which can be in relation to like our applications for employment, our advertisements. They can't be discriminatory. They can be around employment practices, and they can be around equal pay. There's also the discrimination around tenancy, so kind of housing, rentals. If all of a sudden a rental is not available because of perhaps you had an accent, there's these things that are in place for us to be able to claim discrimination around housing. What I will say around the idea of discrimination is often what's really challenging is it's hard to prove. And really knowing what do you need to be able to prove that I've been discriminated against. And I'll talk about a case last year down in southern Alberta. There was a Muslim gentleman who was applying for a rental. And when the woman saw his full name, she actually started texting him and harassing him and saying there was no way that she was going to rent to him. In that case, what was great about that is you then have screenshots and you actually can prove that she's discriminating against him because of his religion and his background. Yeah, no doubt, Nadine. So the trick is with these ones is being able to prove it, and that's the challenge. And that for us as advocates, I know Nadine, like we've talked a lot about, how do we prove it? For example, with a Walmart or a Superstore or something like that, where we're going into number 3 with goods and services, where maybe people are being treated differently or being refused service. How do we prove that? Maybe there's ways that we have to go about doing. I know a couple of us down in the South have talked about creating a secret shopper service to be able to document this stuff so we can prove it. Proving discrimination is challenging, and we have to be really good at documenting all the pieces to make a strong case. The other areas around Alberta law is around publications and notices. So for example, if somebody's handing around flyers that are anti-Black or anti-gay or whatever, that is a violation of the Human Rights Act. And And then also membership in trade unions is another area that's protected under provincial level. So basically, if I can put the provincial level stuff in context or in quick words, it's like, basically, if you were denied service at a business or anything like that, you would file at the Human Rights Act. I think what's important to also note here is that this also relates to like education and healthcare. And I don't think that gets caught in the graphic that the commission has here, but education and healthcare, for example, are under provincial jurisdiction and they are relevant under the Human Rights Act. So we can make complaints there. And like I mentioned earlier, while again, it's not a great place. And I think when we file to the human rights complaints, the commissions, I think our intention when we file should be, one, we want to get the issue documented. We want to get it into the government stats. We want them to see it as an issue. And secondary, it's like, yeah, we want remedy, but not, I will say like the success rate is not super awesome. A lot of times because people maybe don't document and can't really articulate that discrimination piece enough, but it's really important to file and to document. I really believe that to be true, because again, what else do we have? When human rights is primacy law, what else do we have to be able to really put our stuff forward? And when we do advocacy ourselves, maybe whether it's writing a letter, using that human rights language and really tying it to our international obligations is important, because it will help make the case. And often when human rights is used, it challenges those in those public office spaces to be a bit more aware and accountable of what they're doing. So the last piece, and kind of like I mentioned too, is that there are, at the provincial level, there are kind of these formal advocates and mechanisms that do exist as well. And these spaces, I believe, are really important, and they're underused and underknown. Some of them I know some people have not had great experiences with, but, maybe what I'll do is I'll refer to like the health advocate, for example. We started working with the health advocate about 2 or 3 years ago. And what I found is what's really great about the health advocate is they have a direct link into the minister. And often what I see within the government is that you have your elected offices, but you have your bureaucrats. And I often find that there's a little bit of rub there. But so being able to have a mechanism that connects directly into the minister, which is an elected office, to make them aware of the trends that are happening, the issues that are happening, and to have that link is really important. But it's also really important to be able to build those stats and to document issues. And I'll just give you an example. Like in Slave Lake, we were called up there about 1.5 years ago, and a lot of issues around seniors in care with the health facilities and that. Particularly, and what's emerging more and more with that work is particularly the unique needs of Indigenous seniors and those dealing with dementia and lack of language. We submitted all of we were able to document and collect about 50 complaints from seniors in Slave Lake, and we're able to put them in through the Alberta Health Advocate. We also put them into the AHS patient relations, so we could document this stuff. And then what happened is it got the gears grinding. Within AHS, they had to get their gears grinding to do the investigations and follow up with all those 50 complaints. And then the Alberta Health Advocate was able then to start taking it to the minister. While we still have a lot of work to do, at least we know we're getting it into those spaces where these people working within the advocates' offices, we need to see them as allies. And we also, again, coming back to that idea of our different roles in human rights, we have to recognize that there are certain people that can only go so far, but we have to use and work with each other in ways that we complement and strengthen each other rather than write each other off. And I really think that those in these offices the intentions are strong and they're positive, and we need to support each other and work together on these issues. Farah, most of the time, the person being discriminated against are mentally weakened to be motivated. Yes. Farah, in relation to that, in terms of that weakening of the spirit almost of filing, I think that's why we really wanted to build this network of advocates, because if we can have people who can walk with and beside and support, then maybe we can get people through those processes and actually support them in a process in the right kind of way. I find and this is maybe my perception, that people are really alone and they're left alone, and we need spaces where they're supported. Jess, is it possible to report discriminatory policy in the health system? Example, what vaccines are provincially funded rather than discriminatory experience with a person? That's an interesting one, Jess. So if it was like a discriminatory policy in the health system, I'm going to give you an example maybe of this one. And what I've often thought that, you know, collective complaints are something that maybe we as advocates need to think a little bit more about. And I know it's not, we don't really have those spaces, but for example, I think it was 2015 or 2016, there was a practice within AHS where they pulled back on some funding in relation to services for people from the transgender community. And it was what we would call a retrogression of rights. So remember this idea of the progressive realization of rights, that our rights should always be improving. They should not be ever regressing. And so the transgender community, 70 people came together collectively and filed complaints into the Alberta Human Rights Commission, all together at the same time, and making the case about the retrogression of rights around this health service. And within 3 weeks, there was a shift and the minister had made a change. So we as advocates have to just think about, like, how do we use these systems differently? I've often thought with child welfare, for example, how it would be really incredible to be able to document a bunch of cases and take them forward. And I think that's what I was trying to do with like the seniors up in Slave Lake. And we submitted 33 of those into the commission there as well. But what the challenge was is yeah, it's the seniors is a really complicated thing, especially when, you know, they're Caucasian, most of them, and not really able to make their case of how they're being treated differently when they're in a care facility. Is really interesting. So yeah, that's something to think about. I think, you know, the collectives and creating strategy around and documenting, again, is why I think this stuff is so important, and how we can work with these advocates to really make change. Yeah. Well, and Joe, what's interesting about that is age was only integrated into the Alberta Human Rights Act last year. And that was after a huge fight from a group called the Elders Advocates. And it's really amazing, actually. So just quickly, I know we've kind of talked about, I think I'm almost on presenting, and we can just kind of have a bit more of a conversation. I'm trying to think of how we're doing for time. Holy smokes. I just really wanted to put this out there, because one of the things and maybe we don't, I know a lot of you on here will know this stuff and you get it, but I just want to really reaffirm it, that, and kind of maybe Farah, what you're hitting on is this piece of social exclusion, or this where we're discriminated against. It impacts us at so many different levels, and really we have to recognize that there are so many people in our communities that do not even have the capacity to participate, whether it's or to file complaints. They're not seen in the policies, procedures, and that's a really huge piece. And when we think about Canada, and I'll just quickly go through these and then I'll open it up. We think about Canada, we think about genocide. Like, I think about the genocide and the deep history of genocide, and how our laws have been built around that. The Indian Act built around that, built around exclusion. And when we look at the law enforcement, for example, if you look at this, you know, the 1873 with the establishment of the Northwest Mounted Police, it was really to remove the first peoples from the land. It was a real act of removal, and there's so much legislation that happened around that. The erasure of this community is huge. And then we look at Black exclusion. And so relevant right now with the conversations that are going on. But if you look at the history, even here in Edmonton, you can look at the fact that in 1911, Edmonton City Council banned Blacks from the city. In 1905, Albertans were the leads in Canada who made sure that Black people were not allowed to immigrate into this country. It is really, really deep. And then the last one I just want to acknowledge is queer exclusion or the 2S LGBTQ is that the way that homosexuality or gender difference was integrated into our laws over the years was based on this idea of like being an offender, being a sex offender, being dangerous. It was a criminality to be gay. And so we as human rights advocates need to be so aware when we're doing this work that our laws are built upon this kind of ideology of criminalization of all three of these groups and others. And we have to be conscious of that, and we have to use human rights to really start to shift these things. So I think these are really important. And these are, when you look at the 2S LGBTQ issues, it's current, it's real. Even with the Indigenous and the Black communities, they are current and they are real. There's over 70 cases in Edmonton of unsolved homicides within the Somali community. That's unacceptable. And we have to be able to push back. So I'll just look at, does John Humphrey support groups of people or individuals trying to make group submissions to the Alberta Human Rights Commission? Absolutely, Pat and Lyle, that's kind of what we're trying to do with this Stride Advocacy, is really build teams and strategies. And right now there's a couple groups working on issues, like for example, we have some policing stuff, prisons, as well as like Indigenous seniors and language. So we have some systemic groups that are really trying to figure out how to build a strategy forward. And I think when we can work together and strengthen together, there's a lot of possibility. So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. I know that's a lot to take in, and like when you think about all these mechanisms and stuff that exist, but I'd really like to, we've got 15 minutes. I'd really like to open it, and anybody has any, you can feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Maybe we can take a couple questions and then we can wrap it up. Yeah. So feel free, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I'll, if you know how to do that, there's a little thing on your participant list, I think there, and then we can, but if not, we can kind of wrap it up. Pat, Lyle, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm wondering if a presentation from John Humphrey Society could be brought to Red Deer to a specific group of people that are working on culture and racism within the Indigenous community.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we just were invited down by a few people. We just started going down to Red Deer more in November last year to start doing this stuff, and then COVID hit, of course. So we had only done, I think we had done 2 sessions, 2 education sessions down there working with UAVS and
Yes.
Why am I blank? The other team doesn't really have an organization or agency. So we'd love to kind of connect you more in with that and talk about that, because I think in Red Deer there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yes.
And then Grace, can you provide some resources, books on these issues? I sure can put together some stuff. Yeah. Angela, on reserve, absolutely. We were just also orienting with Frog Lake to start getting out there, because I think our goal is really to build this knowledge in people so that we can really start to kind of push the systems back, which is good. Joe, is this closed captioning part of Zoom or is it a separate program? It is Google Slides. Google is an amazing captioning system. I really encourage you to use that. Yes, Julita, please do say something about Red Deer. I feel safe.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everybody. So my name is Julita, and I live in Lacombe, but I do a lot of work, I guess, in central Alberta. And for the past, I think, 2 years, a lot of it has actually been gaining information and training. And I've kind of stalked Renee for the past couple of years for training and just to get to know how to do this type of work. And of course, she is amazing at what she does, as well as the rest of the team. I'm working with a friend of mine. Her name is Sadia Khan. And Renee pushed us, I think it was in March, when we were at the Human Rights Defenders course. And so she really pushed us to start something. And so just this week we were like, okay, no more waiting. We're mobilizing. So the name of the organization is Ubuntu, Central Alberta Mobilizers. And basically what that is to bring the conversation local, to make it local. Because for a lot of these things, we tend to go to Calgary and Edmonton.
Yeah.
Like everybody goes Calgary, Edmonton for training, education, resources, protests, marches. But we want to bring a lot of that to Central Alberta because we do believe that we have that unique story because we're rural as well as we're a little city. And so if you're looking for any more information, we will be launching soft launch next week. Yeah, so get in touch with us. Like Renee has our information. And we're forever sending her emails and texts and everything else because we really want Central Alberta to do its thing because we have unique experiences here in Central Alberta. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you so much, Julita. And I think what I want to add on to that, and it kind of connects to like Nadine with you and with the Epistemiques down south, is the one thing I know and what I've learned over the years is we know that there's a lot of nonprofits and agencies in Alberta. I think that constantly we hear like 26,000 nonprofit organizations. But what I want to say is that one of the things I've heard a lot is that a lot of these nonprofit agencies operate within that ideology and worldview that really aligns with maybe our government. Maybe they're old school, they're traditionals, they haven't evolved to be relevant today, or they don't know how to include or support all people. And I think one of the most important things nowadays is that there's a resurgence and a renewal of different groups emerging and shifting how we do this kind of work around human rights and even social service. So I'm so happy that you've gotten that going, Julita, with Sadia, and I think it's really important. And it's the same thing with the Epistemiques down south. I feel like, Nadine, is that there's groups that are starting to merge and be the new leaders in that nonprofit realm. And we really need to set the precedents and show how we can shift that way, and that it's not reliant on kind of the previous generation of nonprofits. So I just want to really acknowledge the two of you because I think you're both doing really innovative emerging work and being leaders in this, and it's really important. And I'll always remember one of the very first conversations I had with the mayor in Edmonton when I started GHC, like, oh my gosh, it's 16 years ago now. I remember him saying, Renee, why are you doing this work here? Why are you doing this work here? It's not relevant here. Like, it's relevant in other countries. And it just, that piece that you said, Julita, about localizing it is the absolute critical piece. And really when we can start working together across groups, then we can really have a difference. Heath, yes, go for it.
Yeah, I just had a quick thing that I wanted to bring up that just like I know that we joined the Stride as the Self-Advocacy Federation. Especially since COVID, a lot of our other self-advocacy groups from across the province have been able to do a lot more things together. And we already had a provincial group with the Alberta Advocates for Change together. And together we managed to form a town hall last month where we managed to get 16 MLAs to attend, addressing some of the concerns and whatnot that's going on with COVID. But, and this has been a little bit of my neglection, but since you're here now, is that AACT is very interested in partnering with Stride, especially like being able to not only gain from other resources on advocacy, but to contribute whatever we can to.
It's exciting. Yes. Well,
Sweet.
let's make that connect.
Awesome.
Yeah, because I think with the more of us organizations, it's like Stride being, there's organizations and then there's also kind of us as individuals. We can really make an impact. And it's funny because in the fall, we were trying to plan to bring everybody together once so we could really nail into a lot of the systemic issues that are coming up, but now we've got to really rethink that and innovate. It's like everything has changed, but I feel like everything is changing in a way that's allowing us to work differently and how we need to.
Well, and resources like this one with Zoom, even if you can't use a computer and you just have a phone, still having an ability to connect. And I mean, like, that was a large reason why we were able to get that sort of thing running last month, was just that we all of a sudden all realized that we could still communicate.
You did a fantastic job. I was so impressed because you had every party there, and I was so impressed. And I think that's really important too, is really ensuring that we have a balanced perspective. And
it's essential.
Yes, and this is the one thing I want to say about human rights too, is maybe kind of a closing point, unless anybody has any other thoughts. But I've often been criticized because maybe I don't take stands on the left or the right. I consider myself a fence sitter. Because I feel to do this human rights work, we have to be able to negotiate all angles. And we have to be willing to kind of hear all perspectives and worldview and be willing to work with all perspectives and worldviews. So part of human rights, I believe, is about being that kind of neutral force. A lot of human rights advocates do engage politically. Absolutely. It's really critical. But I think when we're doing true human rights work, we're able to kind of put partisanship aside. We're doing political work, but we're able to work together outside of the political spectrum divide, if that makes sense. And I really appreciated that about your session, was you had everybody represented. And I always struggle when I enter a meeting, and one of the first comments I find in opening circles is somebody's got something bad to say about a political party, and it unfortunately just shuts the conversation down for others who may align with. So we've always got to kind of put our assumptions aside. So thank you for that. That was really great. Is there any other questions before we wrap up?
I just wanted to ask about the group. I'm here in Red Deer with Elizabeth Fry Society of Edmonton.
Hi.
And I'm interested in that new Ubuntu. And I actually know Sadia from the Sexual Assault Center.
Perfect.
So I'd love to hear more about that if I could make contact with, how do you say it,
Julita.
I am here and willing. Renee knows.
Awesome.
Do you want to throw, Julita, do you want to throw like an email or something in the chat and people can connect too?
Absolutely.
Rock and roll. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll send it right away.
Yes, we'd love to be involved.
All right. So just to close off, like I will just let you all know, like, so this is, we used to do this human rights training as like a one-day piece, and it was always a bit much. And I think what we've done now is we separated into kind of 4 kind of key sessions that we need to have to really have all those foundations of human rights. So we'll have the next one again, and we'll start to dig into like the complaints process, and we'll start to build, and I can share those 4 sessions with you guys. And so really by the end of that, we can provide a certificate or whatever. But for those of you that are here today, what I'm finding interesting and challenging about Zoom is that we can't monitor our participants as easily. So I think Nexi, you've been kind of catching who's on, but we'll make sure that you get the notice for that next one, and we can keep building together. And I think the beauty of this is we're across the province. We can really strengthen and work across our lines. So I just want to thank you all for—
One more thing, Renee,
yes?
before you
Go for it.
I just want to highlight also that this is a training program that is framed within the STRIDE program, and our objective is that we can support the education of people that already has some interest in advocating for their communities, and so that this training it's used for that. It's used for supporting your community, supporting your own cases, but also organizing ourselves provincially to support those cases that are individual cases, but that are connected to policies that need to be changed, and put some pressure also on the province and on those systems that keep violating human rights or like threatening human rights. So I think that is really, really important. So if you are interested in also working on that part of advocating for others or advocating for your community, then also let us know. We can include you. We have other trainings that are part of this Human Rights 101, and we will love to have people that are well trained and ready to support their community. So that's
absolutely. And Joe, I just want to recognize you all the way from Ontario. That's absolutely awesome. We were excited to see more people from Ontario engaging in our work, and we actually have some other advocates there that want to engage more. So maybe we'll see where things go. And we are part of a national network called Writing Relations, which is working at that national level. I think we at the John Humphrey Center, we're really, I want to make sure we hit every level of jurisdiction. So when I started John Humphrey Center, all my efforts were really focused on the city, the municipality, and how we make a human rights city. Now with Stride, we're kind of being able to move to that provincial level and have influence and impact. And then with Writing Relations, we're really hoping that national piece comes together. So I just want to thank you all for coming. Yes, just maybe stick your name in there for us to do attendance, and we'll let you go from here. And thanks again. And I'm looking forward to meeting you all again soon.